guide us through the research technique, because this took years. It actually took decades. And tell us a little bit about how you found the photos, because you got family photos and things like that, vintage, going back even more decades. So tell us about how this came about.
Sure. So the seeds of this story came about in an undergraduate literature class that I took when I was a junior here. And this literature class exposed me to many different writers of different ethnicities. They were all American writers, right? Some African-American writers, some Asian-American writers. And in this class, I took with our beloved Betty Weidman, who is watching on the Zoom. So she's not in the room, but she's watching this via Zoom. Hi, Betty. Shout out to you. I read Maxine Hong Kingston for the very first time in that class. And I had been a voracious reader of British and American literature ever since I was a 12-year-old girl growing up just a mile south of here, right? So I was a voracious reader. I loved immersing myself in stories. But reading Maxine Hong Kingston was the very first time I ever felt addressed as an Asian American reader. In Woman Warrior, in the beginning of the book, she says, and I don't know, Lori, if you were even in that class with me. You might have, right? Okay, so there are other Queens College alums in the house. And in this book, she says, Chinese Americans, how do you know what's really Chinese versus the movies or Your Crazy Family, right? And I thought, oh my God, that's a great question. I don't know, right? But more than that, it was this feeling of being addressed in the literature, right? In a way that I'd never been addressed before. And in her writing, she also talks about these different iterations of the restrictive immigration laws. She does it mostly in Chinamen, right? The follow-up to Woman Warrior. But it is the white elephant in the room, whether she actually explicitly names it or not, right? And so I was reading Maxine, and I became like completely inspired. And thank goodness that Professor Weidman decided that we could, instead of writing, we could do either a scholarly paper or we could write a piece of creative writing to go with it. And I just ran with it. What I did was I started, so I'm a junior. I think I'm maybe 20 years old at that point. I start asking questions of my family members, my grandparents. I start going through my grandmother's photo albums. My grandmother's family had come to this country in the 1880s. My grandfather's family, these are the people who raised me. He was a descendant of a railroad worker, right? There were no images of the railroad worker because he was alive in the 1860s and had passed away in China. But anyway, so there were all these stories, and people were still around, so I could ask them, right? And it was very exciting, and I photocopied a bunch of the images from my grandmother's albums. There were newspaper articles, and so I just also should say that doing this work was like impacted me a great deal. It helped strengthen my relationship with my family members, right? Because I was asking them questions about themselves. But it also sparked a fire because I thought, what else could I do, right? And so that summer, and by the way, Betty gave me an A+ on the project. Okay, thank you, Betty.